Good morning and good afternoon to those who are joining us from Istanbul. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the director of the Middle East Institute's Turkey program. Today's event is the first event of a series co-hosted by MEI and our partner IstanPol, which is an Istanbul-based research institution. And the name of the series is Turkey Beyond: Trends and Drivers Shaping a Nation in Transition. So the idea to host this series came out of discussions we had with our colleagues at IstanPol, led by Seren. We thought Turkey's activities in its neighborhood in Syria, Iraq, Libya, Eastern Mediterranean are all well documented, but we talk about them here all the time in DC, but less reported are some of the social, political, and economic trends lurking beneath the surface that will likely shape how Turkey's domestic politics, society, and foreign policy evolve in the future. And this series draws on the polling data gathered by and analyzed by IstanPol. The upcoming events will examine the ways in which influential sectors of Turkey's population envision the country's future domestic and foreign policy. So through this series, we hope to shed light on issues such as the country's economy, the institutional setting, the political system, presidential system, as well as Turkey's handling of the Kurdish problem and the Syrian immigrants. So without further ado, let me introduce my excellent panel. Seren Selvin Korkmaz she's the co-founder and executive director of IstanPol, and she's also a non-resident fellow with us. And Edgar Shar is the co-founder and chair of IstanPol. So thanks Edgar and Seren for taking part in this. Today we will talk about polarization in Turkey, but polarization is obviously, it's not a unique Turkish national pathology. So it has become a worldwide phenomenon with negative consequences for democracy across diverse national contexts. So I want to jump right in. Seren, you Edgar and your team at IstanPol wrote this excellent report in 2019 on polarization in Turkey. So please tell us a bit more about the exact content of the report and how you conducted research.
Thank you, Gönül. First of all, thanks for having us. Actually, I am delighted to see that my two institutions is cooperating on that. Actually, before the 2019 elections in Turkey, there was an atmosphere that the opposition will lose the elections in anyhow because of the freezing blocks in the two electoral blocks. So that we try to understand why there is no shift between the blocks before the local elections, to understand the perceptions of people who vote for both the governing ruling party and its ally MHP and the opposition. So that we have conducted focus groups with 47 participants. As you mentioned, it is not a recent research, but especially in this presentation, we would like to combine the differences before the 2019 and after that with our recent research on the perception of youth and migrants and any other different affiliations, which actually creates a difference between these freezing blocks in Turkey.
Excellent. Well, we'll go into the details of the research findings, but I want to start with a simple question. Is polarization always bad? I have recently read an edited volume on political polarization in the United States, and one of the authors defended the polarization, saying Abraham Lincoln chose to polarize the nation on slavery rather than allow the possibility of a long-term compromise. So is there a moral cause to be made for polarization?
Let me jump in if possible. Well, Gönül, first of all, thank you also very much for having us here. It's a great discussion, I think, and a great question to begin with. Well, polarization is not always bad, of course. In fact, it's a natural and intrinsic part of politics in many ways. Polarization, like difference of ideas, and even the competition between the polarized parties can even have sometimes a democratizing effect and consequence. Take, for example, every struggle for rights that are hard fought and hard won in many cases. In those struggle for rights, we can see that polarization clarifies the options facing people. It even, in some instances, helped the party systems to institutionalize, like in the case of the United States, where the polarization between different social sections and circles, created today's party system, which, is institutionalized and has been functioning in a democratic system. However, as we will explain further, the political polarization or the instrumentalization of existing polarization for political purposes creates two mutually distrustful camps, us versus them camps, as very popularly taken, which leaders of the electoral autocratic regimes like Turkey, for example, uses to create a majority that gives a majority to get the consent for their autocratizing political agenda. And the main goal of this autocratizing political agenda is to stay in power.
Edgar, sorry, because political polarization is something different than the cleavages that exist in any given society. I want to get to that, but before that, I want to ask Seren, and then I'll get back to you. Seren, what are the main fault lines in Turkish society that define the current polarization in the country?
Yeah, actually, identity-based fault lines have been part of Turkish society since the foundation of the Republic, and it even goes back to the late Ottoman period. And as part of the national building process, Republican elites have formulated a Turkishness based on Turkish-speaking Sunni Muslim identity with a secular interpretation. Hence, minority groups such as non-Muslims, Kurds, Alevis, they were not treated equally unless they culturally assimilated in this state-defined identity. Also, the assertive secularism policy of the founding Kemalist ideology has excluded pious from this definition, and thus the state and ruling elites use polarizing politics to mobilize the majority and to justify these policies against these other groups to create homogeneous nation state. Actually, related to your first question, somehow in that kind of fragmented society, some degree of polarization is necessary to mobilize a bloc in politics, but maybe we will discuss deeply about why today we have a bad version of polarization, as Edgar mentioned, and these historical identity-based fault lines mainly categorized in Turkey as Turkish Kurdish, Alevi Sunni, and secular pious fault lines. And those fault lines are still significant and determinant in contemporary Turkish politics. There is also economic and demographic fault lines which create left, right, and urban-rural polarization in Turkey. But mainly, polarization happened because of the inability of Turkish political ideal to integrate Kurds and Islamists the pious people into the system with their chosen identities. As pious had a chance to be included in the system under the AKP rule by controlling the state, but they excluded the secular and other various groups throughout their rule. Hence, secular, religious, and Turkish Kurdish polarization continues, and contemporary political polarization strategy of the AKP based on this, the exploiting of these fault lines as main dynamics to boost the bad kind of polarization, as we call it, pernicious polarization in Turkey.
So, Edgar, Seren just mentioned you have these cleavages, this Sunni versus Alevi, you have Turks versus Kurds, secular versus pious. So you have these cleavages, they've been there forever. So what makes Turkey's polarization, today's polarization, so pervasive or so problematic today?
Yeah, you're right. They have been existent forever. And actually, when we take other societies into consideration, we can see that polarization is a social reality in almost all societies. And even in some of these societies, the level of polarization is so high that it cannot even be compared to Turkey. So why do we attach so much importance to political polarization in order to explain almost every political development in contemporary Turkey? Well, yes, polarization at the social level exists almost everywhere because there are similar fault lines in all societies like those Seren mentioned, whether they are identity-based, class-based, or demographic. However, as I was saying in the answer of the first question, here we are talking about the political instrumentalization of these already existing fault lines. And these are instrumentalized for political purposes by political entrepreneurs. In our case, it's President Erdogan primarily, but in some instances, also the opposition. Why? Why opposition? Because by using it for his political aspirations, Mr. Erdogan not only exacerbated the polarization, but he also changed how politics is done in the first place in Turkey. So unless they generate, the actors of opposition generate a new ground for politics and also...
Sorry, can you explain that a little more? What do you mean Erdogan change the way politics is conducted? In what way?
Yeah, actually, identity politics has become throughout this period very popular and relatively easy to make because you know it gives you a certain section of the society as your loyal group. And you can guarantee their votes almost in every elections. And unless the opposition actors generate a new ground for politics, you know, they can only contribute to the continuation of this identity politics and also to the exacerbation of the already existing social fault lines. Because you know, Mr. Erdogan's identity politics, you know, brought about the aggravation of polarization until the second half of 2010s, when I think the opposition finally got this very fact and changed their strategy in many ways, which I believe we will discuss also later.
Yeah. So Edgar, that sounds pretty straightforward. Erdogan capitalized on the existing cleavages. He politicized them. He turned them into an existential struggle, right, for the two camps. And he increased his power, consolidated his power. But how has the opposition reacted to this? Has it developed a counter strategy?
Well, there have always been a counter polarization strategy on the part of the opposition. But the question is, what strategy works best against that very strategy of Mr. Erdogan. What I believe is that until the second half of the 2010s, opposition in Turkey, I mean, almost all opposition actors, because we are talking about a fragmented opposition as far as before 2017 is concerned, they adopted a reciprocal counter-polarization strategy, whereby they they were creating their discourse by using a counter-polarization strategy, as a reciprocal strategy against Erdogan. I mean, it was not a depolarizing strategy, but it was reproducing the use of existing fault lines. But the problem is that this very identity politics was a means to an end for Mr. Erdogan, and it was very functional.
But so explain that a little more for people who don't follow Turkish politics closely. So how you're saying that instead of promoting a different generating new ground, in your own words, the opposition used the same framework, the same cleavages that exist to launch a counter strategy. So what does that mean? What were the specific elements of that strategy?
Okay, let me let me try to briefly explain this. Actually, by using this polarizing strategy, Mr. Erdogan, always came up with some accusations, some accusing discourses for the opposition, using this already existing social fault lines. And the question is, what opposition reacted, how they reacted. I mean, if they, for example, reacted just with similar discourses by accusing Erdogan of doing the same and not trying to create an alternative platform for politics where they, first of all, depolarize the politics and repolarize it again, the way they see politics, with the way they see politics. I mean, they are just playing into Erdogan's hand by only answering to his accusations.
So, for instance, Erdogan was attacking particularly the main opposition, the secularist main opposition party, the CHP, on religious grounds, right? That was his strategy. So he was pitching himself the real representative of the people, which he assumes is deeply pious. So he is not one of elite, he's an outsider, and he represents the real people. Whereas he depicts the CHP, the opposition, as non-national, as foreign, and even sometimes he went as far as calling them internal colonizers. So he frames the CHP as a party that is out of touch with the people, too pro-Western, not religious enough, not nationalist enough, right? So those were the elements that he used. So specifically, how did the CHP respond? Was its response to Erdogan's claims that no, actually we are religious? So and you think that wasn't the right strategy? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. As long as the opposition is answering Erdogan's accusation with the framework that he himself created, they actually accept this framework and the boundaries of that framework, because these are the boundaries of politics in Turkey, framed directly by Mr. Erdogan. However, on the other hand, if they can create an alternative ground for politics where the boundaries drawn by Mr. Erdogan are not anymore valid, well, this is the moment where opposition can really do politics from an alternative perspective, and where they can really, change something, because the framework that's drawn by Mr. Erdogan, accepting it by the opposition, is already playing into Erdogan's hand. This is a game that can only be won by Mr. Erdogan, and that's why he drew these boundaries.
So you're saying that the opposition, led by the CHP, by trying to prove its own religious credentials, it's reproduced this cleavage itself, and the polarization, it's played into Erdogan's polarization tactics. So Seren, but clearly something changed in 2019, right? In 2019 municipal elections, Erdogan's party lost almost all major cities to the opposition. So was that thanks to the fact that the country was less polarized at the time, or the opposition found, as Edgar suggested, new fault lines to polarize the country along?
Actually, I would like to also contribute what Edgar said, and I will reply your question as well. First of all, in the early years of AKP rule, the CHP under Deniz Baykal leadership stood as the guardian of the secular republic and maintaining an oppositional discourse that served the AKP's polarization and populism, as Edgar mentioned. And this only made AKP's job easier. And especially under Baykal, the CHP followed a nationalist agenda, standing aloof toward the Kurdish issue and opposing the EU accession. The party actually has long relied on secular middle class voters and showed an inability to engage with the urban poor. Then, under Kılıçdaroğlu leadership, the CHP also began to be changed. Maybe we can discuss it later, but it is also change related to the circumstances in the country, but also the change within the parties in the opposition, which brings the 2019 victory in the local election. So as a reply to your question, what has changed since 2019 actually? As a typical competitive authoritarian regime, the Turkish government divides the opposition and creating a perception among the public that the opposition cannot win and that their voice will not count. That is why citizens in these regimes share the common perception that the opposition is unable to win. Such was the situation before the local election of 2019, after 18 years of rule by the AKP, both local level and centrally. Now there is a hope for change that can reclaim democracy via elections in Turkey. Gaining the municipal seats has given the opposition some room in the political game. Hence, during the COVID-19 crisis, the government targets municipalities in particular when it intervenes to provide services to people. Also, the opposition has realized that they can win the elections if they unite and collaborate. And they practiced this alliance during the 2019 elections. The Kurdish party, HDP, is not the official member of the Nation Alliance of the opposition, but they have supported the opposition blocs during these elections. In somehow, opposition, which is fragmented in that country, and because of the polarization and Erdogan's populist tactics to fragment, to divide the opposition, they were unable to create a bloc. But 2019 elections basically shows that if they can build a bloc, if they can unite, they can win the elections. That's why it was something like that practice that the Turkish opposition learned. And another issue regarding the local elections is that it was a game changer for two reasons relating to the symbolic power of local governance in Turkey. First, municipalities have always provided a place in which the opposition could act throughout the Republican period. For instance, Islamists, Refah Party, just before the AKP, represented pious people via the municipalities in a way that they created a pathway for the AKP. So it created a place for the opposition. And in Turkey, what we have seen in our research, and also in this research that we conducted in 2019, the leadership and personality are still very important in Turkish politics and have a crucial impact on voting behavior. That is why still in Turkey, people seek for protectors. So because of the flaws of weak institutions. So being mayor allows you to prove your leadership capacity to serve people. And as President Erdogan previously did himself as mayor of Istanbul, actually. So this is a kind of symbolic importance. Another issue regarding the municipalities, they are the core location for rent-seeking and clientelistic relations in Turkey. Edgar mainly mentioned the identity-based polarization in Turkey, but another issue related with the polarization in Turkey, Erdogan actually created an us versus them dichotomy in the country, but this is not only related with the identity-based issue. He created a sultanistic patrimonial power relation. So government employed welfare services and distribution mechanisms to reward the supporters and punish the opponents. So while this category of us has benefited from the gains of holding executive seats of the country, the others have been categorically excluded from the system. And they have created a kind of neo-patrimonial based wealth distribution in the country. By the way, despite the presence of formative rifts that I mentioned at the beginning, before the AKP, there was some degree of balance of power between different groups. As right-wing parties dominate the political system and create a majority in the polls, the left-wing parties have found place themselves in the coalition of governments. Also, the secular Republican ideology was dominant in some state institutions, such as military or judiciary. But now, which makes the polarization in Turkey pernicious, is that there is a two group. One group benefits from the all power relations, all of the economic benefits of the country. The second group actually excluded from the system. And the municipalities are the core location of this rent-seeking and clientelistic relations in Turkey. So by controlling the metropolitan municipalities with their huge budgets, the AKP consolidated its financial and political agenda at the local level. As I mentioned, the party actually followed a kind of neoliberal populist agenda combined with this increasing nepotism and clientelism. Hence, the loss of major cities, including Istanbul, Ankara, is a major blow for AKP's rent-seeking economy. Furthermore, AKP has used the urban space and municipality services to establish these rent mechanisms, and with the policies of commodification of land, urban transformation projects. That is why he created the AKP created its own elites, which rules all of the resources in the country, and this problem related, especially this blow of rent-seeking economy, also created a damage in the AKP. Again, I would like to emphasize that the local elections created new leaders in Turkey. Recent polls show that with their performance during the COVID-19 crisis, despite all the restrictions imposed by the AKP central government, the mayors of the Istanbul and Ankara, Ekrem İmamoğlu and Mansur Yavaş, they respectively emerge as potential presidential leaders compete with Erdogan. And also, one last remark about that, Raves Research, located in Diyarbakir, in the southeast of Turkey, they found that the popularity of the CHP and İmamoğlu is increasing among the Kurdish youth, and CHP is increasing its support in the Kurdish populated area. So it is also the outcome of this collaboration in the 2019 elections.
It's really, what you said, Seren, is really important. So just to recap, you're saying that the opposition was successful in local elections because they've launched this, they employed this new strategy that aimed to go beyond the existing cleavages. So the CHP wanted to, again, go beyond the Kurds versus Turks cleavage by, in an official way, aligning with the Kurds in the local elections, and also went beyond this conservative versus secular divide by fielding candidates such as Istanbul mayor and Ankara mayor, who come from conservative right-wing nationalist backgrounds. And now that they've captured these municipalities, they do have an opportunity to build a track record of success among the working class, because that's something that we haven't seen. The CHP identifies itself as a social democratic party, but maybe except for a brief era in the 1970s, the CHP was not really did not perform as a social democratic party. And starting from 1990s, the Islamists actually captured the working class. Again, I think playing to the cultural sensitivities of the people as well. And also through using municipalities, the Islamist party managed to consolidate its base among pious working class people. So the fact that the CHP now controls big municipalities in the country, they can reach out to those neglected parts of the country. So this is a great opportunity for the opposition party. So we have several questions from the audience, but before that, I want to ask something that's really I find it fascinating. Do you think we talked about all this? The social, these cleavages, pre-existing cleavages, but is there an ideological polarization in Turkey? I mean, it's largely a right-wing country. There is widespread consensus on some issues, such as the Kurdish question, for instance, right? Anti-Americanism, or on Turkey's identity, on Turkey's national identity as a Sunni Muslim nation, which of course leads to discrimination against non-Muslims and Alevis. So my question is there really, it seems like there's a huge block, if you look at Turkish politics, maybe with the exception of the HDP, you see a huge block of center-right parties, and that includes the CHP. So my question is there a real ideological polarization in the country?
Are you asking Edgar?
Anyone, whoever wants to.
Edgar, please go on, then I can contribute.
Okay, thank you. Well, if we take Kurds or Alevis as minorities that were that became victim of the state practices throughout the Republican history, when we take them into consideration and their political stance and historic where they stood politically throughout the history of Turkish Republic, we would claim that okay, the vast majority of Turkish political community is anti-Kurd and anti-Alevi. So, where is the polarization? Well, that would be taking Turkish reality into consideration. That would be a very reductionist understanding of how things are or how things have been in Turkish politics. Why? Because, you know, this is again a political issue. Mr. Erdogan actually created a kind of polarization in Turkish society for his political aspirations and to stay in power. And this is actually a very well-known story that we know from other countries' experiences in the world, you know, in all electoral autocratic systems. So that automatically creates a political polarization between those who are anti-Erdogan and who are pro-Erdogan. So no matter from what political background they are coming from. This is exactly the reason why the opposition bloc, if I may call them a bloc, is so fragmented and heterogene in many ways. Because, you know, the more people get polarized based on their political allegiance, the less relevant existing social identities and fault lines become to understand the contemporary Turkish politics. So you can see, for example, a secular nationalist from İYİ Party automatically but unofficially aligning with HDP Kurdish voters in an election, which was the case in 2019 elections in many metropolitan municipalities. So whatever the political entrepreneurs do among themselves, because we are criticizing, for example, the opposition actors of not aligning themselves officially with the HDP or excluding in a way the Kurds from the pro-democratic alliance against Mr. Erdogan. We see that at the grassroots level, this alliance becomes a reality. So, I mean, this authoritarian versus democratic political polarization, as we see now in Hungary, in Poland, even in the United States, this actually made the existing ideological differences and even some identitarian fault lines to some extent irrelevant, or not as relevant as they were once upon a time.
But I have reservations about that. I mean, first of all, that dividing it as a democracy versus authoritarianism, that assumes that the opposition is perfectly democratic, and I have serious doubts about that, given the fact that I think in the Turkish political context, where you stand on the Kurdish question really says a lot about how democratic you are. And the Kurdish question remains the opposition's soft underbelly. And that's one of the reasons why Erdogan can actually drive a wedge between these opposition parties that are part of the opposition coalition. It's really fragile. But I'll go back to you, Seren, very briefly, because I have several questions here from the audience, so we have enough time to get to them. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, actually, Edgar has explained the political dimension of this polarization. Just I would like to remind that in Turkey, yes, there is no a certain, we cannot totally categorize the whole opposition parts as democratic, as you mentioned. But here, for instance, in the elections, the choice will be between those two categories, autocratization and democratization. We cannot ensure that the opposition bloc will agree on the most important issues of Turkey, which creates this cleavage, such as Kurdish issue. But we mainly argue that opposition may create an agenda and a kind of maybe parliamentary system that all parts of the Turkey will can involve a kind of inclusive policy-making process after that. That is the aim for democratization, actually, by calling it as democracy bloc. This is what we would like to say. And one recent remark, actually, maybe if we can think about, for instance, the secular Islamist Kılıç, CHP's secular Alevi leader Kılıçdaroğlu transformed the CHP's fear of Islamism and embraced an inclusive policy towards the pious voters. That is why I think the political affiliations, the political blocs also matters. Maybe we can also discuss about the emergence of the two splinter parties founded by the AKP ministers, Ali Babacan and Ahmet Davutoğlu. The contribution of these two parties to the breaking of the polarization in the country, I think, also important impact on this issue.
May I also respond to that, what Gönül, you said before you go on with the questions? May I? Okay.
Sure, of course.
Well, you know, talking about autocratization and democratization, these are processes. For example, Turkey has not yet become a perfect autocracy. But we have a governing bloc whose practices have, continuously autocratized Turkey. And now, on the other hand, we have an opposition that is, as you mentioned, not perfectly democratic, but that promise a certain democratization with their practices, and who they are also promising against the autocratizing practices of the current governing bloc led by Mr. Erdogan. So when we see that this is a polarization between those who are pro-democratic and who are pro-autocracy, we are not talking about perfect ideal types. We are just referring to a political process, because this very fragmented and fragile opposition bloc, what they can do if, let's say, they win the elections, what they can do is to bring Turkey back to a procedural democracy, a minimal democracy, where we can not solve the Kurdish issue, for example, but we can start talking about the Kurdish issue. Just like in the example of Spain of the 70s. You know, Spain, for example, has still some problems with this separatist or Catalans problem. They have not been yet able to solve this problem, but they're at least in a state where they can talk about these problems. Well, I will call it a very democratizing success if they can do that in the future.
Okay, so one question from Cenk Karataş. Do you think economic hardships may level out those perceived differences in society and unify Turkish public under the umbrella of a commonly shared poverty? Can there be a new political breakout from this commonality?
Yeah, actually, there is, as I mentioned previously, Erdogan has created a rent-seeking economy. And the supporters of the government has benefited from this economy. And especially in the first years of the AKP government, Turkey has actually experienced a well-governance of the economy. But nowadays, especially with the impact of the COVID-19, the government cannot offer solutions to the everyday problems of the people. That is why we think that the opposition has also an advantage, and especially the local governance, which responds to the everyday economic problems of the people, can create a kind of agenda for the opposition, which will appeal the voice of the Turkish people. That's why I always call that the real majority in Turkish people who experience the poverty, actually.
One more question from this is from Emre İşyeri. How does populism and authoritarianism interact in Turkish society?
They have perfectly interacted, because these regimes, we call them, like many of our fellow political scientist colleagues, electoral autocracies, where populism looms large. How? Because, normally they can autocratize only if they create a majority that can stay really behind this autocratizing agenda. And how can you really produce and create this majority? This is exactly where populist discourses play an important role. As we said, politicization or a politicized use of existing social cleavages to create a very big us camp, not them camp, but an us camp. And this has been possible through some populist discourses. And as also Seren mentioned, there is a political, economic aspect of the story as well. You can only autocratize a regime if you can, roughly speaking, feed the majority that is to stay behind these autocratizing practices. And how do they do that? They do that, like all other populists do, through some clientelistic, neo-patrimonial mechanisms, which Erdogan successfully has done, and which even inspired Hungary's Orban.
Well, I have a question about whether Erdogan can continue to utilize Islam as a polarizing tool. Analyzing Turkey through this lens of secular versus religious dichotomy has always been very popular, and not just in academic circles, but also in the policy-making community. And of course, this tendency gained more currency after the AKP came to power. But I think we have to change that lens, because I mean, after 2 decades in power, the AKP divided the Islamist scene and generated a conservative backlash against Erdogan's rule. A great example is the female student from Boğaziçi who wear the Islamic scarf. Her name is Şeyma Altundal. As many of you may know, the appointment of an outside rector to this very esteemed Istanbul University has led to weeks of demonstrations, hundreds of arrests, and that's one of the most vocal and sustained complaints against Erdogan. And Şeyma is one of the many students who joined the protests. She comes from a conservative background. She's wearing the headscarf, and she said that she had beaten, and her headscarf was dislodged by police when she was arrested. So the picture of a veiled student whose father, by the way, worked for an Islamic NGO that's very close to the AKP. So that was pretty uncomfortable for the government. A lynch campaign has been launched against her on social media by pro-government circles. And it was uncomfortable because Erdogan was trying to turn the protests into a culture war between liberals and conservatives. But it's clear that Erdogan does not have a monopoly over these conservative segments of the country. Obviously, we have an Islamist party in opposition as well. So what does that tell us about the utility of using that conservative versus secular dichotomy to understand Turkish politics and society, and also whether Erdogan can successfully use that Islam card to polarize the country?
Actually, today, nowadays, not the identity, but bread and butter matters. But your question is very important. And nowadays, the Boğaziçi University protest is one of the main issue of Turkey. But we have a similar approach from Erdogan. Whenever he has a crisis, political or economic crisis, he stick to polarization. But it doesn't work anymore, I think. Somehow it works, but this is related to what you say, Gönül. If Erdogan actually has come across a woman who wear headscarf, but in the opposition side, I think he doubles down on polarization. It now seems that Erdogan's Muslim nationalism has not been widely accepted by the younger generation, even among the children of those who considers themselves pious or conservative. You mentioned Shema. They couldn't actually achieve to establish a hegemonic rule over ideas. His ideal of raising pious generation could not work. And yeah, youth in Turkey suffer from actually intense uncertainty, high rates of unemployment, and almost all changes to the educational system and the violation of personal liberties. Those young generations suffer from these problems, not related to the problems with their secular ideology. And actually, our recent research also suggests that young people harbor deep suspicions of the political establishment, and they are in search of new political strategies that promise them more freedom and integration with the world. And I can say that Erdogan's polarization strategy doesn't work for youth. Maybe I can mention a sample about that. On October, the youth branch of the AKP released a 3-minute video addresses the youth. And this video titled, "Who Are You?" And the voice in the video asks repeatedly that questions and answers for youth. And the answers include the names of the prominent figure from Islamic, Ottoman, and Turkish history, including the Sultan Mehmet and Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, even Prophet Muhammad. And the video ends with the image of Erdogan that is created with all other images of the historical figures. In other words, all history is represented in one man. The voice again tells that you are Erdogan. This video has backfired and criticized by the youth. They have replied with their videos and social media messages which tell them who are they by explaining their everyday struggle, so that you can see that it doesn't work actually. His strategies on polarization and ideological cleavage doesn't work for the youth.
Great point, Seren. So a couple questions about foreign policy, so I'm going to join them. So one question is, what does this discussion of polarization mean for the future of Turkish politics and its foreign policy?
Well, foreign policy has been a functional part or element of Erdogan's political polarization, because you know, it is about it, because it is a nativistic discourse. Foreign policy can easily become a means. However, personally, I believe that Erdogan might have already reached to the limits of the use of you know, some kind of populist foreign policy discourses. Maybe internally he can continue doing that. However, because after the election of President Biden and now the realignment of the EU and the US, you know, in its anti-Erdogan tone, I think Ankara will have to take some measures and some steps. Otherwise, it will have to face some consequences, and it will also heat further Turkey economically in many ways. But may I also add some an important point, which I think also very important to understand, to what Seren said previously. Well, as we both try to underline, during these political polarizations, actually, the camps are now anti-Erdogan and pro-Erdogan, which means that your political identity became your new social identity. So being pro-Erdogan or anti-Erdogan is now much more important than being Kurd, Turk, secular, pious. But these are only fault lines that are relevant as far as they can be instrumentalized for a political purpose. So in that sense, as many studies, including ours, also reveal, these existing fault lines are utterly less apparent in the younger generations. That's why for those in the governing bloc and, you know, beginning from Mr. Erdogan, they once upon a time used "we are Muslims" against others. Now, when they are confronted by a Muslim or a person who declares him or herself as being Muslim publicly, then they say we are real Muslims. It was not real actually with Şeyma at Boğaziçi University. I remember Erdogan also attacked Hüda Kaya, an HDP MP, who is also headscarfed. And he said, and I quote, "Oh, their headscarves are some strange and very much different than ours," he said. So, I mean, it is a political issue, and that's why using Islam and other kind of fault lines, these are relevant only as far as they're relevant for a political purpose.
And a question, maybe final, I can take one more question about the Syrian refugees. I mean, where do they stand in all of this? How significant of a factor the Syrian refugees are in terms of this polarization?
They are actually invisible. But we have all mentioned the dynamics of the polarization in Turkey with Edgar. But what we have seen are several research conducted by other firms. The only issue that all of the countries agreed, all of the sides of the polarization agreed, that anti-migrant attitudes in Turkey. So still Turkey do not have a integration policy which will include the Syrians in society, and luckily we don't have a right-wing populist party who push these anti-migrant sentiments in Turkey. That's why it seems invisible nowadays. But as part of the polarization, I would like to add one word about the foreign policy issue. Actually, Gönül, just a word. It is all related to what we have discussed. Popular support for Turkey's EU membership actually still, despite all anti-Western discourse of Erdogan, is so strong. And according to recent data by Metropol, majority of the voters are in favor of the EU membership, and they think that foreign policy priorities should lie with the US and EU rather than Russia and China.
Yeah, and just to add one more thing on the Syrian refugee issue, unfortunately, I mean, when I look at public opinion polls conducted in Turkey, there is a consensus, an unfortunate consensus on the Syrian refugees, that they have to go home, that they're not welcome. So I guess on that particular issue, a polarization would be a welcome development. So one question about the new parties. Recently, Muharrem İnce, who was the CHP's presidential candidate, he launched his own party, and we have Deva and Gelecek, who are led by former Erdogan allies, former foreign Prime Minister Davutoğlu and Finance Minister Ali Babacan. So we are seeing the emergence of new parties, and what do they do to this polarization, the scene of polarization?
Well, one thing is sure and for certain, and that is that the opposition parties finally became successful in the elections to the extent that they understood how, or with what kind of politics they can really defeat Erdogan. And in the 2019 elections, they finally understood that. And this is also one of the reasons why in the recent polls, opposition seems to be doing better than the governing bloc in the upcoming elections. When I look at Muharrem İnce's accounts and statements about how he sees politics, I see quite the opposite, to be honestly speaking. Because the opposition became successful to the extent that they depersonalized politics, that they created a big bloc, even if unofficial in some instances. And this is utterly a depersonalized version of politics. But when I, look at what Muharrem İnce is doing, I see some personal aspirations and motives that draw his, political steps. And what it will do to the polarization, it will not make a very big change to the existing polarization, because even if Mr. Erdogan and his governing bloc has been trying to benefit from this splitting political steps, I think it will not create a very big change it will not be a big game changer as far as this bloc-wise nature of Turkish politics is concerned.
Thank you. And the very last question, I know I keep saying that, but there's so many great questions. So very briefly, if possible, on social media. What is the role of social media in all of this? Does it make things worse?
Actually, in Turkey, as I mentioned, government tried to control all over the parts of the business in Turkey. That is why they have controlled the media, and in the lack of independent media, social media create a platform for the opposition movements to express themselves. But I think it's my opinion that it is so limited, actually, to mobilize people, to reach all of the segments of society. It also helps to create echo chambers, actually, within this polarized politics. But I think it is also very crucial. It's not enough, but it is very crucial because of the problem related with the independent media in Turkey.
Edgar, any final words on that?
The importance of social media has long been also understood by the governing bloc itself as well, because they created a troll army, actually, just in order to be seen powerful also in that particular media, because we know that especially the people in the anti-Erdogan bloc, they resorted to social media very much, and especially the younger generations, they gave up watching TV, etc. And we see that via their troll armies, what government is doing is just try to look powerful, but it actually, in my opinion, shows us how unpowerful or fragile they are in that.
All right. Well, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. I greatly enjoyed it. Thank you, Seren. Thank you, Edgar. And thanks to those who joined us today. We'll have more of these discussions in the months to come. Keep following us.